Okay, so something a little different. I'm just going to babble on. This is going to be for software developers. I have I've had these conversations with junior developers over the last decade, right? And I bring this up to them. I never know if any of them follow through on it. But there's so many good takeaways from this for a software developer, even today, especially today. And it really shows you where the roots of a lot of today's software practices come from. It comes from this essay. It's by Eric S. Raymond, lovingly referred to as ESR. This was released as an essay back in 1997, and then there's a book that was released a couple years later. And I think out of all the software development related books out there, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, I think it has the highest rating I've ever seen. So, and there's really only two books that I recommend to software developers, and this essay is definitely one of them. So I'm not going to really read the essay. I'm going to stop at it's very well written. I highly suggest that you read it, but I'm just going to stop at some of the points on it and kind of tell you what was going on at that time, right? So he starts it off at 1991. Now, in 1991, uh, I was fairly busted up, and one of my best friends in high school loaded me into his car, and I was on crutches. Well, I was on crutches. I was on painkillers. I was on muscle relaxers and anticoagulants. I was just a mess, but I had a fairly full bank account at the time, and I wasn't going anywhere unless my friend was going to pick me up and take me with them, right? So we went to the computer store, and we immediately loaded up a cart with just about the best that they had in the store. Now, I'm a pretty young guy, and I'm pretty loopy. My friend is there to help translate. But even the salesman didn't really believe that I was about to pay cash for all of this, right? And we pulled up to the register, and the guy in front of me had this big box Borland C++, and at the time Borland C++ was the gold standard for C software development. And I asked my friend to go run back and get that exact box. And that is really where I kind of started back on a software development path in my life, right? When I was a kid, I actually did a little bit of software development. When I was 10 years old, my aunt thought I was nuts because I wanted software development books instead of toys. But that's a whole nother psychology thing, I guess. But during this time, we had Linux, and Linux was just popping up. So in 1991, 1992, 1993, I was back in school. I was back in college, and I was specifically going for a computer science degree. The years that I had gone to school before that were kind of just to collect credits for the Army, which is a long story. Um, but when I was in school, we had Unix, right? And that was it, and that was the gold standard. You wanted to do your stuff on Unix. You didn't want to get stuck on the AS400 because the AS400 was slow. The AS400 had this little guy that popped up all the time, used to drive me nuts. You'd hit the save key, and a little guy would pop up, or you'd try to execute a small piece of code, and a little guy would pop up for like 10 minutes, waiting for permission to run. Oh man, it was a nightmare. But Unix, boom. You would get in, you would use, the schools would give you Telnet access. And once you had a Telnet account on a college Unix box, you generally had that account forever. So Unix was always something that I really wanted to do. My first job was not Unix. My first job was on OS2. However, the software developer that worked there, I was talking with him. My first job as a software developer, and I was talking to him, and he said, "Hey, you want to try out Linux? If you really, really like Unix and you would rather write stuff on that, you should really check out Linux." And I didn't quite know what it was. I had heard some stuff about it. I had wanted to be on, at the time, I think I was on SCO Unix, right? Because I think SCO was, oh, there was FreeBSD and there was SCO, but SCO you could run Oracle on. So you could run a bootleg copy of Oracle. Don't sue me, Oracle. That's decades and decades ago. But you could get Oracle running on SCO. And later on, you could get Oracle running on Linux. And I did that a couple times. But the big thing was that Linux was out there. It came on came on something like at least 32 floppies. These are all you know. The last time I talked about the Cathedral and the Bazaar, the developers I was talking to didn't even have, they never had a computer with floppies, right? They never owned one. They never bought floppies. They would never go to the store and buy 100 pack of floppies and go through 50% of them to find out which ones were bad, right? But that's what it was like back in the day. And so he came over. We started the downloading them individually, and then I think I stayed up all night doing that, and maybe even part of the next night. And then he came over, and we spent our time figuring out how to install Linux. There were a couple READMEs, but there wasn't very much information on how to do it, and especially drivers were a big problem because you had to compile all of your drivers into the kernel at the time, or that was the most reliable way that I ended up doing it. But so that was my college years, and Linux was Linux was really popular very fast. I thought so, right? There were people in the Unix community that didn't like Linux, and I didn't really care. I had some fun exposure. 1996, I worked at a shop in 1996 where we were using Sun Solaris, right? And my SCO kind of helped a little bit with that job, not much because there wasn't much to do. And then we also used something called AT&T Unix. I shit you not, AT&T Unix. They had their own flavor of Unix, but we used to write code on those things, and big, gigantic, survive a nuclear holocaust servers, right? Big boxes, throw them out the window, barely have a scratch. Terribly underpowered, but it ran Unix. So 1996 comes along, and I'm full into Linux. It's now my favorite operating system. Around 1997, I would say I wanted to stop doing stuff on Microsoft. I had been doing C++ on Microsoft and a lot of C on OS2. I've been doing Visual Basic, and I just wanted out. And right around this time, just to throw this out, one of the best software developers that I ever worked with, a very smart guy, came running into the office, and at the time, we were practicing something called that we were calling extreme programming back in the day, right? And I think that I always joke that that we did extreme programming because we always had 5 developers, but we only had 3 computers. So we would work on the same code. But the truth is that rather than get stuck, right, we would call somebody over to help get us unstuck quickly. And a lot of times, we would just kind of banter back and forth to get the code written, if that makes sense. Right? So somebody would write something, I would say, "Oh, that's bad," and I would rewrite it, and then they would look at it and they'd say, "No, no, no, that doesn't do it," or "That's not what I had in mind," and then they'd rewrite it. I remember the smartest developer that I worked with wrote the most complicated line of code I'd ever seen. I think that I've still ever seen in my life, and I had to explain to him why he had to unwrap it, and that's what it was like. Is you would argue over code, and so that kind of sets us up to where I was. Then 1997 comes around, and that's when this paper comes out, and this is the essay that convinced me that I wanted to do more in Linux. I didn't want to be in the Microsoft ecosphere. I didn't like the OS2 ecosphere, and at the time, OS2, 1997, OS2 had released Wizard like a year before, and it was a complete flop in the business world, and everybody was going to Microsoft. Everybody was they were all trying all kinds of things to replace their centralized computing. Let me put it that way. That was 1996, 1997, right? So ESR goes into what he was famous for, and when really what he should be famous for and what he is famous for is writing this paper, and that is he wrote and now I'm having a complete. He wrote a POP3 client. He wrote a mail client, an email client. Now, by today's standards, it's not Google email, but you got to keep in mind he needed a POP3 client, right? And now we get to the whole reason why I'm really talking about this is because I want to talk about these points, right? Because I think that a lot of these, if you read this paper and you get these points, these are my takeaways, right? But point number 1 that he spells out here: every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And this is important to be a software developer, I always thought. If you don't have something that's driving you to have interest in writing software, then you're never going to be a great software developer. You're never going to be like a really good software developer, right? There has to be that drive, or else you're going to get burned out really quick. You're not going to make it 10 years. You're not going to make it 20 years or more, right? It's just not going to happen. But all the best software is written by developers that care about the software that they're writing also. So that's kind of, right? The software developer needs to get something out of it. Now, back in the day, a lot of it had to do with fame. It just had to do with the fact that you could write something that people wanted, right? And that was a fantastic itch. I can there's actually a point where I have a much better story about scratching that itch, but writing software that you wanted to write was important. And for me at the time, I wasn't gonna be writing that software inside of the Microsoft ecosphere back in 1997, 1998, 1999, right? So I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to get more into open source development. That's where my interest was, and that's what was scratching my itch, right? But I think that itch is real important in order for you to be motivated in software development. This is one of the this is this becomes a very hard point. So this is his second point that he makes in his essay. Good programmers know what to write. Great ones know what to rewrite and reuse. So, man, is this important, right? So, we're making a fine distinction with this statement, and it's an important one. Reusing code and knowing what to rewrite and what not to rewrite, because most of the time as a software developer, you're not going to get that green field, right? You're going to be working on a project. Sometimes you might be working on a project for 9 years, right? Same code base, same libraries, same technology. It can happen, trust me. But you can't throw away everything and rewrite everything when it comes to software development when you're working at a company that is maintaining 10, sometimes 20, 30 years worth of code, right? I remember in 2000, one of the tasks that I was handed at a job was to write X25 network security code. And I was like, "You're insane. I'm doing Java." And they're like, "Oh yeah, 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 yeah. We need you to communicate in Java on X25." I was like, "I don't know if that can be done." But man, it was and we'll get to that too cuz that shows up later too. But so many big systems, you can't just rewrite it. You can't just throw it out. You need to understand what that logic is doing. But sometimes you have to throw it out. And one of the first things that I ever had to throw out was um, this software developer had created what I like to call a fiefdom. He had these scripts that he was running. Now, these scripts were run once a week, and they were started Monday morning at 6 a.m. And the reason that they were started Monday morning at 6 a.m. was because they were needed Tuesday afternoon. So the big problem is that they took 24 to 26 hours to run. They were highly inaccurate reports that it was generating. And I got handed it. Now, I didn't know what to do, right? So I got nothing on this whatsoever. I remember they just kind of said, "Here's the guy's computer that used to do this, and this is now your job. Like, this is the most important thing we can give you to do, and we need you to concentrate on this for the next month." And I was like, "Oh." And I'm looking at it and it's trash. It's absolute, utter fucking trash. It's an abuse of data structures, which we'll see in here too. but it was an utter abuse of data structures and computing power is what this query, large sets of queries, right? But I threw it away and I rewrote it. And when I took the results to my immediate manager, he said this can't be right. And one of the reasons why he said it couldn't be right was because it took less than 7 minutes for me to get the numbers. And I said, no, those are right. I went through line by line, figuring out exactly what was being done. That's right. And then they threw it into production, and boom, it was right. They handed the numbers. They handed both sets of numbers for a month to a meeting room full of the largest executives at a Fortune 500 company, and they argued over which ones were correct. And after the second time that I did that, they were the hands down. They were like, no, these are the actual numbers. These are, and they're up to date, and they're from this morning, and we can run this now multiple times a day, right? Because this was a highly shifting data set. But sometimes you do have to rewrite. But the great developers, they do. They know when to reuse and they know what to rewrite, right? So keep that in mind, right? So that's point number 2. We're getting through this slowly. So he talks about that. Number 3, and you got to remember, I read this in 1997, right? These are important points that sometimes I use this one right here, particularly, I use as a litmus test to see how good of a developer I'm working with, right? So point number 3 here is plan to throw one away. You will anyhow. And now he gives a great description of doing this. But in a sense, what it means is that the first time that you attack a problem that you haven't seen before or you haven't done before, so the first time that you do something with software, that as a software developer, the first time that you use a library, all kinds of things, the first time that you use a new linting tool or a new testing tool, you learn from that. And if you're willing to throw away what you learned, what you produced when you learned, and just write it a second time, you will end up, if you're paying attention, you will end up with much better code, much higher quality code, and less code to do the same thing. You'll be using your libraries much better. Throwing away your code is by no means any kind of a mission that you've failed, right? It's that you understand the problem and now you want to do it better. And that's an itch that should be looked for in software developers, right? The software developers that want to do it better, right? And that's a fairly easy thing to weed out in software developers, but it's not done much. But yeah, so if that makes sense, right? And then he goes down here. I think he says it pretty well. But number 4, if you have the right attitude, interesting problems will find you. So I always took, my takeaway from this was that if you're always willing to help other people with their problems, right? If you're not one of these developers that it's like, oh, I'm not on that team, so I'm not going to help that guy, or, that's your code that you need to do, those kind of developers, right? Nobody helps them. But if you're the kind of developer that will just, take the time to stop what you're doing and work on somebody else's problems, you will end up seeing interesting problems, and you will end up seeing interesting solutions or interesting attempts to that problem. A lot of times, if I've seen the problem before and I come in and I look at what a software developer is doing, I see things in their design that was better than what I did before. So that's kind of the right, having the right attitude, being able to drop what you're doing and go help somebody else, and that solves an itch too. And then the more interesting problems, they end up floating your way. It's That's my takeaway from number 4. Number 5. Boy, and this is a story right here. When you lose interest in a program, your last duty to it is to hand it off to a competent successor. And this is really important. So I got burned on this, and it's one of my greatest regrets as a software developer. I'd have to say that the year was 1999. And I was all gung-ho to release something that people wanted, something on the internet that people wanted. Now, at the time, I was playing a game very heavily. It was Quake 2, and we can go all the way up to number 1 here, which is the itch, right? Because I was solving an itch with Quake 2. And what it was I was in a Quake 2 clan. The internet was not, we didn't all have the messaging capability from user to user in 1999 was not that good. And I used to play online. I used to play Quake 2. I used to play it competitively. There were many different ladders that were out there that me and my clan, my Quake 2 clan, that we used to play, right? And it was always hard to find scrimmage matches. So you could find ladder matches, and a lot of times people didn't show up for those ladder matches. So I'd say that probably, 2 out of 10 times, 20% of the time, we would be moved up the ladder because another team didn't show up for the match. But it was almost impossible to find scrims, and at the time, the only thing we had was IRC. So we'd go from IRC server to, we'd have 5 people on a team. So all 5 of us would split off. We'd go to different IRC servers. We'd go to different Quake clan servers, and we would challenge them to a scrim, right? We'd say, "Hey, do you want to scrim?" Pretty simple, right? Big pain in the ass. And I thought, my God, if we can simply centralize this a little bit, throw a simple facade over it, a simple view on top of it, we can just display a list of clans, and we can put in a simple ranking system, and we can put in a simple win-loss system in there. And when I say we, I mean me by myself, right? And I did it. It was called Scrim on Demand. It was a utter fucking success and an utter fucking nightmare at the same time. I thought, this is relatively simple, right? I found this guy who was like, he ran it on a university server without permission. It wasn't like a box in a dorm room, right? It was a real box with a real hefty connection, so it could handle the client side. The server side was written in C, because the server was fairly simple, right? The client, however, I wrote it in Visual Basic, and this was the kind of the final straw where I just got to get away from Microsoft. I wrote it in Visual Basic. I released the client, and this is how I released the client. I remember um, I went to my clan, which was about 30, 40 people at the time. And I said, "Hey guys, I've got this app. Maybe we could give it to one or two of the other clans to try it out and see if it works." And I did that, and I woke up the next day. I went to work. I got home about 6 o'clock. Fired up my computer to play Quake. Looked at my personal email account, which, was nothing but ads or whatever spam at the time, right? Nobody sent emails back then. Looked at my personal email account, and there were over 2,000 in less than 24 hours. There were 2,000 emails in my email box with an error. A simple error. 2,000 emails in my email box. Simple error. Not a simple error, turns out, right? Turns out that maybe if I had been able to pay, and this was another reason why I had to get off Microsoft, open source, right? In order for me to get to that next tier of information to find out what error I was having, why I had this percentage of computers out there that were working, and a fairly large percent of those that wasn't working at all. I finally figured it out, though. I finally got it fixed. I released it, and that took me 3 days. 3 days of getting emails. The emails are just piling up. More and more people are. There was a gaming website that announced it. So it went from just being on one IRC server to being worldwide within a week. And I just freaked out. There was this kid who was like, "Oh, I want to redo this, and I want to do this, and I want to do it in this language, and I want to do it right." And I was like, "You're right. I did it in the wrong. I did it in Microsoft. I should not have done it in Microsoft. You're absolutely right. And if you want it, it's yours. Here's the repository. Here's all the source code I have. Here's my hookup for a server." And it died about a month later. It actually died for a good reason, though, because somebody wrote something better. The kid that took it over didn't do it. He didn't put the work in that would needed to be. I couldn't put the work in. I had a full-time job and a child at the time. So I couldn't put the work in, and that scared the hell out of me. But I handed it off to a successor that wasn't competent. And you'll see this. You'll see an even worse thing out there in the business world, right? You'll see guys that when they lose interest in a program, or they lose interest in working at a company, let's say the guy just put in 2 weeks, right? Well, he lost interest months ago. He lost interest before he started looking for a job, right? And what a lot of software companies will do is, by the time this person quits, or if they fire the only person that knows the software, which happens a lot more than you would think, when they fire the only person that knows the software, it's not handed off, right? So it's very important to hand off your software, your projects. When you pull one person off of a project or put them on a project, it's very important that the person that's being handed that work knows what the person is leaving did, right? And knows how they did it. They don't have to know exactly. They don't need to know everything, but they should know something. Some of that knowledge needs to be translated, right? I didn't do a good job of translating that knowledge either when it came to scrim on demand. So I fumbled that ball hard. But lessons learned, right? But that's my takeaway now, 30 years after. Treating your users as code developers is number 6 on here. I can't tell you how important this was. So this came out in 1997, and I read it almost the day. This thing fired through the Linux community like wildfire. It was phenomenally popular. But you, as a software developer, you have users. You have people that use your software. Most of the time, unfortunately, most of the time, you're not writing this stuff for yourself. You're writing it for your users. And if you can't treat them as code developers, if you have people in the middle between you and those users, the more people you have in the middle, the more scrum masters, the more project managers, the more release managers, the more agile coaches, the more, what am I missing here? Am I missing the more QA that you have, right? That you're adding on to this project, it's taking the developers away from the users. And 1997, when I read this was one of the best things that clicked with me. So I worked in 1997, 1998, 1999, around that time. I worked at a very large company. It was a very big company. It was a great company to work for at the time. It was where I decided I never wanted to do Microsoft again, but I was also doing OS2. I had some chance to do some stuff on mainframe. I had some chances to do some stuff on did I say OS2? And I had some chances to do some stuff, not much on Unix. So it was a large environment to play around in. It satisfied my itches. But one of the rooms that was filled with my users 24/7, I think. Well, no, not 24/7, but definitely early in the morning and definitely later in the evening. There were always a lot of people in there working hard. But they were my users. And there's about 20 of them, 25 of them total. And in the morning, right, I might pop in to the cash room, although there wasn't any cash there. I don't know why they called it the cash room. But I would pop in where all these people were working on my software, and I would ask them if they were having any problems. How are things going? Is something wrong? Is something giving you an issue? Do you have any suggestions that will make things quicker? For instance, they were like, we don't use the plus key. We want, the numeric plus key. And when we're entering things in, we want the plus key to do this. And I was like, oh, done. Next day, feature in, happy user, right? The feedback cycle was quick. They knew what I was working on. They knew if I was working on something important and hard, or they knew if I could, or they knew that I wasn't, or that I had time to do all the little things, because the more I was in there asking them if everything was okay, the more little things that, it was a great situation anyways. But it kept me close to the users. I got feedback quickly. I was able to give them software quickly because it was a small set of users. And after a while, they trusted me. They were tolerant of my faults. Whenever, let's say, I put in software that broke something, they knew that I would pull it out really quickly. And that was a great thing, but it taught me the value of how important it is for the actual software developer to be talking to the users. Because before that, I was separated from the users by project managers and salesmen, basically. And if you didn't have a good project manager, let's say your project manager, I don't know, didn't have a software background at all before they became a project manager, um, yeah, it was a nightmare. It was an utter nightmare. Or even, well, it was a nightmare, right? So these are your walls to writing quality software that your users actually want to use, right? Let's go on to number 7 here. He talks about Emacs in here some more, which is really so. Yeah, he's got a whole section for release early and release often. So that was a big Linux thing, was to release early and release often. That's where that comes from. That comes from that open source mentality. That was something I was able to do in the 90s with this small user base. I moved on from that company, and I went to an even larger company after that, where I wasn't able to do that. I couldn't release often. I had to release on other departments' schedules, right? I had to schedule time. Um, I didn't even know my customers at this next company, and it was, in a lot of ways, it was killing the quality of my code. I remember I was handed something by an architect, and I was handed something by an architect. I was told by the architect this is exactly what they want. I did it. It passed the architect, and it got to the customers, and the customers, it's not that it didn't work. The customers absolutely hated it. Hated it, hated it, hated it. And it was the first time that I had talked to this group of users. And within about 15 minutes, I knew the things that they hated. It allowed me to change the program. It allowed me to simplify the user interface. And boom, they were happy with it. Just 15 minutes, developer, users, boom. And then I developed a relationship with them, and they ended up presenting me with more problems that I liked to do, right? And at that company, I ended up working very hard because I ended up seeing a lot of challenges that I liked a lot. But we're now at release early, release often. This is an agile thing, right? This is a big thing on Agile. We've got to be able to automate our releases so that we can release often. And it doesn't get done. It does get done, but it gets done by small. It gets done by small, disciplined teams, right? It doesn't get done by release early, release often. The idea is that you are going to release less features more often and get feedback quicker, have a quicker cycle between your customers, and then that way your customers will get one thing. They can tell you if they like it, you can improve it, then you can move on to the next thing and do that quickly. You hand them a ton of stuff all at once without really discussing it or running it by them or them using it, getting their hands on it, so to speak, and you lose that, right? So these things all start tying together into how Agile is supposed to work, right? Is you get your developers close to your customers so that they understand the customer's pain, so that they want to solve that itch, that itch that the customer has. And you want to release early and release often. And these are things that, man, when it can be done, it's a beautiful thing, right? And it works great. It works absolutely great. And then here, number 8, I'm just going to start with the Linus Law, right? Linus's Law first, which is given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And then ESR puts it this way: given a large enough beta tester and code developer base, almost every problem will be characterized quickly and the fix obvious to someone, right? And when we talk about Agile, or when I talk about Agile, there's a lot of tools that fall underneath Agile. One of them is XP programming, which has turned into pair programming. That's what it's called. That's what the kids call it. Pair programming. This is where pair programming comes in inside of an Agile process. This is where the review of the program, the code review of the program comes in the Agile process. And this is where the quality control aspect of Agile is supposed to come into the process, right? Is that given enough people can see these bugs, right? Boom. They should be easy, and it should be obvious how to fix them by somebody, right? Whether it's a workaround in the GUI, or whether it's something on the back end, or whether it's bad math, right? Get enough eyes on it, and somebody will have an idea, right? Maybe the first idea you have to throw away because you learned something from that, and your second try is much better. But yeah, that's the whole idea. So before Agile tried to come up with a framework for this, right? It was just XP programming. It was just extreme programming, and it was considered extreme because the idea was that you had one keyboard and you wanted to type. Both developers were challenged and about it, right? And you only, so the keyboard went back and forth, the ideas went back and forth, right? And then that's the whole point. Really the big thing why it became an open source standard and a mantra in open source, right? Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Why that becomes a mantra is because if you release your code as open source that anybody can download and change, if you release code and somebody else comes up with a patch and they give you that patch and you don't put it in your code, but they need it to work in their code, then they can just use it. But if they find a bug and they give it to you, then they found a bug and they gave you a fix, right? So that's, and that used to happen a lot more. Well, I mean, it's still happening, right? All this stuff is still happening in the Linux world. It just never mushroomed quite as much as I would have liked it to when I was younger, I guess, right? A lot of people, fucking Macs, right? MacBooks. But this is a big tenet. This right here is what a lot of the Agile process is all about. It's what, if you boil it down, this is the key, right? This is the secret sauce. However, they need to know what they're doing, right? So a common thing, this will probably get me some kind of hate, but a common thing is you put QA in there that doesn't know how to QA, and they end up doing something like, well, we'll work around the fact that QA doesn't know how to QA, by having the developers write a test script for QA. And then that way QA can go through that test script, and then we've got that whole, we got that whole warm and fuzzy before we hand this over to the client. The problem is that now that QA person has become a box checker, right? They're not an expert user, they're just a box checker. Whereas a developer that is close to the actual users and understands how they use the application will be able to understand their problems, and boom, if they release early, they release often. If they can beta release to a certain set of power users, it's much more valuable in the given enough eyeballs. All bugs are shallow. You want to avoid anytime that you see a checkbox job, you need to get rid of that job. And it usually comes with a title. Like, not software developer. Let me see. So that was number 8, and I think we're very close to being done. How many eyeballs? We're scrolling through this. Like I said, I'm just giving my takeaways. Number 9. Yes. Smart data structures and dumb code works a lot better than the other way around. Holy cow. Holy cow. There's so many examples. You show up at a company and there's 150 tables. 25% of those tables have almost duplicate names. And they're all just flat tables with very, very, very loose relations, right? Poor data structures. And then you have to make up for it with fancy code. You have to make up for it with stupid triggers. You have to make up for it with stupid PL/SQL. This is just my opinion, right? But if you can get your data structures good, and you don't have to work with utter nonsense, and you can migrate your data structures, right? You can make your code simpler. And that's important. That's something to keep in mind in software development. That has not changed. Point number 9 here, this has not changed since the dawn of software development. This has not changed, right? Since the dawn of software development. Better data structures. Back in the day with C, you used to be able, if you were able to be smart with your data structures, you were able to do magical things on the wire. You were able to do magical things with math, right? If you just knew how to structure the data quicker and better. He then goes in a little more here about releasing often and what the payoff of these simple measures are, right? But let's go with number 10 here. If you treat your beta testers as if they're your most valuable resources, they will respond by becoming your most valuable resource. And I would try this a lot. I would try this a lot with QA. My philosophy with QA was that I work for QA. When QA finds a problem, then I need to stop what I'm doing, and if they need help understanding the problem, then I need to help understand the problem. If they need help documenting the problem, I need to help document the problem and make sure that problem gets corrected in the future, right? The problem is, right, that, well, your power users, your beta testers, these are your users. I prefer to call them power users because people want to be beta testers, but power users are a much different animal in my mind. Power users are the people that really know the software. They rely on it. They can see things that could make their job easier using the software. These are your beta testers, your power users, right? Beta testers, this goes back to the cash room, right? I had a good rapport with the users. They were willing to be my beta testers, and they were power users. So when they opened up the application, they knew what kind of stuff they could run through it and what kind of stuff they shouldn't run through it, or, stuff like that. So I trusted them, and they gave me very quick feedback. And the more times that I got it right, the more likely they were to trust me when I wanted to release something, right? And it becomes this give and take relationship. But they become your most valuable resource for high quality, is for you to become close with your I now that 30 years later, I don't like the term beta tester for this. 30 years later, I would replace this with power user. To me, it's got a very different connotation. But that is the way that it works. Number 11. The next best thing to having good ideas is recognizing good ideas from your users. Sometimes the latter is better. The latter is better. So this is important, right? This is now a reoccurring theme. Right? That your users, the people who rely on your software, the people that have to use it every day, are going to have some of the best ideas for improving that software. So that's why you need to listen to them. And if you're a software developer and you are removed from your users, and maybe you're a software developer on a project and nobody's even really sat down and explained how to use the software that you're writing code for. Maybe that's something that's actually a problem too, right? But you have to be able to get good ideas. And this is where pair programming really helps, because you end up having another set of eyes with good ideas. Right? Sometimes you have to fight for Jack Welch wrote a book. This was a book that, now that I think about it, I probably read back in this time, but he was a GE guy. And one of the lines that stuck with me out of his book was that, and I'm paraphrasing, is that when you have a good idea, sometimes you have to shout about your idea until people get it. Right? Sometimes people don't get it. Well, you don't want to put your users into that place where the users feel like they have a really good idea and they have to shout at you to get that through. Most people will try and bring it up a couple times, and then they'll just forget it, and they'll never bring you ideas again. Right? I used to do that to all kinds of people, right? But hey, you don't want to listen to me. I don't need to tell you anything more than 3 times, right? If I tell you something 3 times, and you're not listening, there's no point in me telling you anything ever again. It's just kind of a thing. But keep that in mind. Let's jump to 12. Often, the most striking and innovative solutions come from realizing that your concept of the problem was wrong. This is a hard one. This is a lot harder than you might ever think. I was working on... I'm going to have a cigarette. I was working on an extension to SendMail. I won't go into what this extension to SendMail did, but I was working on an extension to SendMail. I was positive, absolutely positive. The year on this would have been, 1999, 2000, right? But I was positive that I had it, that I had the idea, that I could figure it out. I just needed to write this SendMail extension, and then boom, all things would be solved. I could trick the world into believing what I wanted to believe. And I was wrong. I was terribly wrong. It was the first time I ever had a boss yell at me. Well, outside of like a restaurant owner, right? But he yelled at me. Thousands and thousands of crazy dead letters went out, and which led me to I had an itch. I had all these thousands. My boss was like really super mad at me. He's like, all these need to be sent out. They have to get to where they're going. So I called it Dead Letter Resurrector, right? And I put that out on the internet, open source, and it kind of took off too. I ended up with an email box full of emails on that one too. And I was like, dude, it's open source. Just do it. This isn't something I'm maintaining, but you can be wrong. You can be wrong. And I've been there a couple times. There was one time that I was doing some stuff with encryption, encrypting connections, and it was Java. I wanted to custom write a class that would allow a specific kind of connection from an untrusted client, right? Crazy stuff, but at the time you couldn't do it. Better libraries, right? But I was wrong. I thought I had gotten it working, but I think maybe I had been working too hard on the problem and I wasn't getting enough sleep or something, because I never got that to work again, but I burned way too much time on that. So sometimes you have to know that your concept of what the problem was in the first place was wrong, right? So in both cases, SendMail, I was trying to do something that you just couldn't do, right? And in the SSH, or in the encryption part, I was just doing something nutty that nobody wanted to do anyways, right? So you got to keep that in mind. It's a hard one. It's a hard one to accept that you don't understand the problem. And I think one of the best ways that I hear that put is you have to be able to admit that you don't know enough to know how much you don't know, right? You have to, I hope that makes sense. And then 13, perfection in design is not achieved when there is nothing more to add, but rather when there is nothing more to take away. There's a concept in Agile is that you want to start with the simplest thing that works, right? And then you want to build on that. You want to build on top of that. The reason is because you don't want to try and to write perfection all at once, right? You want to build up to that perfection. You want to add your features as, one at a time. You want to release them quickly so you get feedback, so you don't get bogged down on 30 different things that are wrong when there's only one thing. Perfection in design is a big mistake, and that's what a lot of people. So for instance, when I would say to a developer, okay, I understand this much better now, let's throw this code away And sometimes I'll get a response when I tell another developer that's what I've done. I'll get the response, well, I would have just written it perfectly the first time. And this is the most arrogant thing. And right there, that's the litmus test that I was talking about earlier for whether or not that person's a good developer. If they think the first time that they're going to write something, they're going to write it perfect. Oh, you need to watch that guy. Move him into management. Something. He's not there for the code. But yeah. And then this is where a big thing in Agile where you want to be able to take a step to refactor. And a lot of times you want to organize that code, you want to streamline it, and you want to remove any of the cruft. You want to remove the stuff that doesn't need to be there. You want to make it simpler. And in that way, you're going to get closer to perfection in your code, right? This is like one of the greatest documents ever. This had one of the biggest effects on me as a developer. So now we're on 14. Any tool should be useful in the expected way, but a truly great tool lends itself to uses you never expected. And this applies a lot to, let's say, like libraries and things like that. You want them to be useful. You want them to be open. And when they are used in a way that you didn't expect them to be used, you want to simplify things so that they can be used in more ways than that. You have to this is one of those things that you maybe need to see more important, but a lot of developers will lock other third parties into a way of communicating, right? Like, we're only going to allow a DB connection. We're not going to extract that away. And then you end up with developers trying to replicate data across databases with triggers, and everything becomes a nightmare. I think my dogs are ready to go out again. But it should be useful. It should work the way that it's supposed to work. It should have an expected behavior, but it should lend itself to be reused in ways that maybe you didn't think it could be reused. And then he goes in and he gives a good example of that in here. And then 15, when writing gateway software or any kind, take pains to distribute the data stream. Take pains to disturb the data stream as little as possible, and never throw away information unless the recipient forces you to. So that's really a design thing on here. But, the idea is to, if you can, keep the data off the wire. Don't make your software go and get the same thing every time it needs to use it. That would be bad design. Right? That would, especially if it's data that's not changing. But if it is data that is changing, you should have some type of event. And I think we're down to 16. When your language is nowhere near Turing complete, syntactic sugar can be your friend. And this is another thing. This is another good programming practice that should be stressed in Agile. And that is properly naming things, right? So I come from a time when we might actually write assembly, or we might have a restriction on the number of characters that you can put in a method name or a variable name, right? These are back on 8-bit and 16-bit computers. Making your code readable is very important. And that was something that I knew when, right off, when I was sitting down with one of the best developers I've ever had the opportunity to work with very early on in my career, and he's showing me one line, and it's the most complicated, convoluted thing I've ever seen in my life. And by unwinding it and renaming a few things, we were able to make it. It ended up being 4 lines instead of one, but we made it totally easy to read, and it still maintained. Back then we were writing for performance, right? We're not writing software for 486s, we're writing software for 386 Unix boxes, right? So, or the equivalent of a 386 at the time, let me put it that way. A lot of these things were Sun Solaris boxes. But so that's what we were doing, and that's what this means, is that, you know, when you can't when your code becomes convoluted, you need to come up with some type of syntactic sugar that's going to let the developer know what that code does. It doesn't require comments. The code should be readable. You shouldn't have to put comments in. I'm not against comments, because if you can't write something that is fairly easy to understand for the next developer, you should put some kind of comment in there. But 17. A security system is only as secure as its secret. Beware of pseudo secrets. So back in the day, they'd drop hidden files, they'd drop all kinds of things, they'd put password inside of the binary, they would do just all kinds of stuff that wasn't security. Now, hopefully today, 30 years later, well, no, 97? Hopefully today we have much better security practices. We're storing our secrets correctly, so to speak. But man, that was important back in the day. Never leave security till the last thing, right? And then to solve an interesting problem, start by finding a problem that is interesting to you. So this is, if you want to get good at software development, right? The way to get good, this is for all of you young developers out there, but the way to get good at software development is to find something that interests you in software development and screw with it. You don't have to be the best. You don't have to come up with the next greatest software, right? You don't have to come up with the next greatest library. If you want to write an HTML server, write an HTML server. If you want to write, one of the things that I used to do was I used to buy all of these stupid Chinese devices back in the day. And I'm talking about, oh, good Lord, I used to order them all the way back in 1997. I would find these obscure websites with Chinese goods on them, things that looked like Apple products and stuff like that. And I would buy them, and then I'd see if I could put Linux on it. And if I could, I'd see if I could put a graphics library on it. And if I could, you get the point. But I had all these little dumb devices that I had tried to do different things with and tried to hook up things with. And that was kind of what kept me interested and got me better at writing software in the beginning, was that I had these interesting little problems that I was coming up with that I wanted to solve, right? And the best way, because if you hit the skids, so to speak, well, that's not really the term that I want. If you try to hit the ground running and you go get your job and you don't have something that keeps that spark, that keeps that interest, you're going to get burned out. You're going to be management. I don't know what to say. And I believe that's, oh, well, no, we still got 19 here. I thought we're going down. This is going to take a while. Oh, gee. So we haven't even gotten into management philosophies yet. Provided the development coordinator has a communications medium at least as good as the internet and knows how to lead without coercion, many heads are inevitably better than one. That's a mouthful. Provided the development coordinator has communications medium at least as good as the internet and knows how to lead without coercion, many heads are inevitably better than one. So this, to me, this is where Agile went from the Bazaar to Cathedral very quickly, right? And you need to read the paper, and maybe I didn't explain this, but there's differences between Cathedral mentality and Bazaar mentality. In a Bazaar, and you can think of a classic Bazaar where shit is sold and stuff, services are brought to light, right? You have a lot of innovation. You have a lot of people working independently and working on things that they have common interests with and progressing those ideas, right? And those are the kinds of things, and that's the kind of productivity that a Bazaar has. A cathedral, however, a cathedral pro- a cathedral procedurizes everything to the point where you no longer have creativity, where you no longer have innovation. So when somebody says they're agile, do they mean big A or do they mean little a? Do they mean that they throw nonsense on stories on a Kanban board, or do they actually have teams that communicate about this stuff, right? Are the developers working together or are they working independently, right? And does your management rely on a stick instead of interesting carrots that scratch itches, right? That's what we're talking about. Because if you don't have a good development coordinator that has good communication, right? And I think this extends from just being on the internet, but if they can't communicate properly with the software developers, or they can't communicate properly with the users, and more importantly, they can't bridge the users and the developers together, then they're worthless, and you'd be better off having your developers have the many heads doing that job of coordination of tasks. And when that happens, you end up with a more merit-based system. You end up with developers that push each other to be a little better, than instead of having some centralized authority that the developers are just trying to slack in front of, right? I don't know what to say. That makes sense? You should read this. It's pretty good. He talks about fetch mail in here again, right? On management and the Maginot Line. Yes. So this talks a lot about when open source software came out, when Linux started to become popular, when people in corporate America started hearing about Linux. A lot of the pushback was that, well, it's open source. You can't do open source. Who owns the software? Who maintains it? You know, nobody's going to have any incentive to maintain it. all kinds of stuff like that came out. Um, there wasn't a structure, right? There wasn't a project manager, and there wasn't a QA department that ran scripts. Um, I mean, yeah, right. So let's see. He's got a point down here because he goes into a lot of this, and he goes into it really good. Now, a lot of like agile gurus, I mean, they totally miss so much of the management, and they don't have productive teams. They can't scale a team over 4 developers because they don't know the secret sauce, right? And I don't know what to say. This is all the yeah. This is a good part in here, right? So this talks about what management does, right? And what its responsibilities are, and to define goals and keep everybody pointed in the same direction. Well, a team of developers that are working closely together in an open source project, a lot of times there's no manager. There's no project manager. There's no one with the job of project manager. That doesn't that ceases to become a title with a position that needs to be filled, and it ends up becoming a role taken on by the maintainer of the open source project, right? Monitor and make sure crucial details don't get skipped. Your users will help you do that. Your developers can do that, right? Motivate people to do boring and unnecessary drudge work. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've had 3 really good project managers in my life, but they were rare, and they all were very, very technical. They weren't, they all had very technical backgrounds. Let me put it that way. To organize the deployment of people for best productivity. This is what a self-organizing team does, right? And then to marshal resources needed to sustain the project. So here we get into marshaling resources that the project needs. Does this need to be a person, right? Do any of these need? So you got to ask yourself, if they're not necessary, if we don't need a person to do this, right? Then why do we have people that have the title and that's all they do in Agile? Just a question. I wanted to throw that out. Something that's bothered me for 30 years. So I'm just scrolling down. We're done with the notes. This is a really important essay to read. It really is. I think this is a bit of history. I'm surprised that the last group of software developers that I talked to didn't know about this and didn't know that this was the birth of Agile right here. This was before this, right? We had what they like to call watered down or waterfall development, right? Where the users would talk to the project managers would talk to the architects would then write up their papers and requirements, and then your requirements were handed to your developer, and this was a waterfall process, right? So it's great that and you should know what a waterfall process is. You should be able to identify that. What hasn't been done in Agile is it hasn't been identified that waterfall processes have been added to Agile. And every time a waterfall process is added, it's a checkbox position. It's a position that's just checking off a box. It's not really adding creativity to the process, so to speak. And those kind of things are important. This is what the spirit was that spawned open source. This is what the spirit was that wanted that was supposed to be a developer revolution for high quality software that was accessible by anybody. So I just wanted to get this out there because I've never ever sat down and just gone through these points one by one and explained how crucial the Cathedral and the Bazaar was to modern day software development, and how right now, 25 years after this was written, I think it's time that the software development community reevaluate how they're doing software to get away from the Cathedral. Because the one thing that hasn't changed is that when things get controlled by a Cathedral mentality, software development and software developers suffer. So, wow, that's my point. All right. Have a good one. If you have any questions, go ahead, throw them down there. I'm actually going to share this personally with a couple of people that may or may not be interested in it at all. But yeah, have a good one.